See, I think we are already overrunning the time, isn't it? And I think there'll be a lot of questions that you would have. So I'll be short. But I think the questions will be more revealing, because a number of things that the two of them said needs to be actually clarified. I think I'm not very sure that I understood it. I'm almost entirely sure that many of you didn't. But at the end of the day, I think to summarize Rathin, it was concentrated on the fiscal deficit. A, that this fiscal deficit, which is larger than what the FRBM provides for, is number one, not expansionary, and number two, that it actually violates the leeway that the FRBM itself gives to have a larger deficit. He also mentioned a third thing, which is that the deficit might end up being larger than what it's currently there. And of course, there is the whole issue of off-budget operations of the government. But quite apart from that, it might be larger than what is being put at the moment. Now, that's one part of a discourse about budgets. And one of the things that over the last 15 or 20 years, and certainly for the last 5 or 6 that you've been following, it dominates budget discussions, because whenever budgets come up, the fiscal deficit, the idea that the government should control its fiscal deficit, is something which has almost been sealed into us, although governments habitually cross the deficit mark. But the extent to which they cross it is usually limited. So you go to 3, 3.5, rather than go up to 5 or 6, at least the announced ones. Now, I don't want to add too much to this except to simply say that Rathin is absolutely right to say that things are much worse on the fiscal deficit side and will turn out to be worse when the actual numbers are there. Because, in fact, the tax revenues which are likely to be collected will be less than what is assumed in the current revised estimates. Possibly by an amount somewhere between 1,30,000 to 1,50,000 crores. The gross tax collections will be less, and the only way of doing that is take what was collected in December, up to December, and assume that what's going to be collected between December and the end of March is going to be exactly the same proportion that was actually done in 1819. So if you do that, you get a number somewhere between 1,40,000 and 1,50,000 crores, which doubles the shortfall. Okay. Now, of course, the deficit need not increase by that amount because expenditure could be cut, in which case, of course, it would be even more contractionary than the other way. In other words, the point is that we've got a fiscal hole, which means, and this is the bottom line, we've got a fiscal hole which is much larger than anyone is willing to acknowledge. And it's so large that in a situation where we find ourselves trying to actually do anything, even if this large fiscal hole isn't correcting the downward trajectory of the real economy. In other words, fiscal policy is such that the fiscal deficit numbers are also such that we don't have, or seemingly we do not have a weapon to do any correction. Now I think Pranab built on that in the sense that he went beyond a set of issues which are outside the government. And these are very, very important issues, stretching from the way the government itself uses off-budget items, how these off-budget items, particularly the NSSF, tie into other macroeconomic indicators like the savings rate, the reciprocal way of which is your multiplier. All of these things are stuff which are part of what governments do, and in the Indian case, that the government itself is often seemingly ignorant that it does any such thing. These are things which happen, which should be policy, but increasingly, and this is the impression I got from Pranab's speech, that the government itself doesn't know that all of this is happening. Now, that brings me to another concept of a deficit, which I'm sure none of you are today at all even thinking about when you think about the budget. You might actually think about this when you're doing either macro one or maybe even monetary policy, which is that ages ago when I was a student, when Rosen was a student, our budgets used to have something called the monetized deficit. Yes. In which case the government used to use the ability of the Reserve Bank to actually create more money to in fact finance its own deficit. Now the difference between a deficit, a fiscal deficit as we know it now, and a monetized deficit is the fiscal deficit you've got to borrow from someone and pay interest on it. A monetized deficit, you don't pay interest. You simply print the money and it's sort of, yeah, it's nothing. Now, the way I interpret the last few remarks of Pranab's is the following, which is that is it time that we think about the monetization in the economy beyond the way it's happening now, to actually look back at the whole issue of, after all, monetization is something which is a sovereign decision. And over the years, not just India, country after country after country has given up a weapon which, mind you, was the only weapon which Keynes thought of when he talked about the fiscal deficit. He wasn't talking so much about borrowing from others. And I think one of the things that this budget, to me, has done is the following. Note, unlike almost every budget which you might have read about in the last 3 or 4 years or 5 years, whenever you've been reading budgets carefully, there was a great deal of talk in previous budgets that the fiscal deficit shouldn't be breached. This year, on the other hand, almost everyone wanted the finance minister to breach it. So this year you had a situation where if the finance minister had breached it, no bloody heaven would have fallen. So she breached it. She added 0.5%. This guy thinks the 0.5% is still not valid. But nonetheless, she breached it by exactly what is, in some sense, legal. As her previous Secretary Finance said, our actual deficit is near about 5. She could have actually said, look here, we are in a much worse shape. The actual was 5. I've got to breach it a little more. She could have breached it a little more. The expectation was that the fiscal deficit is high. The problem in the economy is such that you need a certain fiscal stimulus, and the idea that the fiscal deficit is something you should control and control solidly had given way in this budget. It was an opportunity if you wanted to do it. She took the sign of not doing it, but in the process, of course, adding to the mess that is underneath various accounts. And of course, not doing enough or not doing anything really to actually give a fiscal stimulus. So the real economy continues to depend upon the whims or the animal spirits, if you would like to still call them, of our investors, of what happened to the world market, neither of which is going anywhere at the moment. Now, it is in this situation that we find ourselves. A world economy which is not giving us the ability to export and therefore pull ourselves out of trouble. A domestic economy where investors are running scared of a number of things, their own balance sheets, an economy where the demand doesn't seem to be growing, and a situation where government orders are not being paid for. And in that situation, investments are not coming. And last, you have a situation where the consumers are also not spending, many of them because they don't have the money to spend, but others because they're waiting and watching. The government, of course, made things into a huge mess here, both on the fiscal side as well as on the stimulus side, by giving the biggest, in a sense, the biggest policy decision it made was between last year's budget and this year's budget, which was a corporate tax cut of a huge amount, which obviously has a consequence both for the amount of taxes you collect, and given that a corporate tax with that investment climate does not lead to more investment, you simply transferred a certain amount from the government to the corporates who are sitting on top of cash because they're not investing. Some of it is going into the stock market, and the stimulus is not coming. So the government is not doing stimulus because it's scared of the fiscal deficit. It's not thinking about a number of issues which have been raised. It's certainly not thinking about a monetized deficit. And the world over, the monetized deficit is not being thought of. Why? The usual argument against a monetized deficit is that it will lead to inflation. Okay, that's the argument. Nothing else. It's just the old Friedmanite argument about put in more cash and there will be inflation. There has not been more cash in the world economy, ever, and pumped up so quickly as between 2008 and now. And this has been a period of world history where inflation, if anything, has been low. The point is that there are more things in this world than the sort of economic gospels which build up and which governments actually seem to accept. So I think that's another set of questions that you guys might ask. And let me end by saying that deficits, government, twin budget, twin budget, finish them. I mean, in addition to all of this, India has two major structural problems which has always been. One is our fisc has been weak, mainly because our taxes have been low. But we've had another deficit which is equally important, and that is that we have almost always had a trade deficit, and we've almost had a current account deficit as a result. And we've not been able to do anything about it. We've got into economic crisis where these deficits have not been accommodated. Usually, when it's been doing very well, our deficit has actually grown, and we've kept growing through it. Today, we have another peculiarity, which is for a very long period of time, we have not allowed the rupee to depreciate. Normally, the Indian rupee has depreciated fairly steadily. In the last 4 or 5 years, it has not. And in a world economy going the way it is, it means that if you continue to do so, your exports will suffer and your deficits will get weaker. That too is something which normally used to be a front thing in the minds of the RBI. That's not happening again. And in terms of the mess that we find ourselves today, this is an additional problem which needs to be discussed, and it's not being discussed. So I'll end here simply saying the following, that things are probably a bit worse than my previous two speakers made it sound like.